Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Horn Call podcast. My name is James Bolden. I'm your host and the publications editor for the International Horn Society. Now, in the intro to episode 2, I realized I rambled on for far too long, so I'm not going to do that to you this time. I just want to make a couple of quick points about various things related to my job with the IHS, and we will get to our awesome discussion today with the very talented Gina Gillie. The first thing is, if you have not had a chance to go check out the offerings on the IHS virtual workshop, please do that as soon as you can, because the time that those are going to be available is limited. They aren't going to stay up forever. But it is a really awesome collection of some great presenters and clinicians. And as you probably know by this point, the 52nd International Horn Symposium, which was slated to be held at the University of Oregon, had to be canceled because of COVID-19. But in lieu of that, a very, very awesome digital workshop was put together on fairly short notice by Dan Phillips, Jeff Snedeker, and Lydia Van Driel. So be sure to go check that out. You must be an IHS member and logged into hornsociety.org. Speaking of being an IHS member, you probably have received, if you haven't yet, you probably will very soon, your physical and or digital copy of the October 2020 issue of the Horn Call. And I encourage you to take a look at all of the articles in there. We worked very hard, the editorial team, on putting together the October 2020 issue. Of course, I have to give it up again for my predecessor, Bill Scharnberg, who put in place such a great system of getting things together for the Horn Call. So without further ado, I want to introduce my next guest for episode 3. She is a multi-talented composer, performer, teacher. Her name is Gina Gillie. She teaches at Pacific Lutheran University in Washington State, and I feel honored and privileged to be able to have a discussion with her. She's a good friend of mine, a colleague, and we've known each other for quite some time. We first met when we were in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison quite a number of years ago. We touch on some really fun, interesting topics that I think are not only interesting for horn players, but for any budding composers and those looking to get into music publishing. So without further ado, here is my interview with Gina Gillie. And my guest today on the Horn Call podcast is Dr. Gina Gillie. Welcome.
Thank you, James.
We're so excited to have you here. And where are you calling in from?
I am in Puyallup, Washington.
Okay, and that's near Tacoma, right?
Near Tacoma, 40 miles south of Seattle.
Okay, awesome. So I think probably a good place to start is where I've started with the last couple of guests on the podcast, is just what you've been up to during the COVID-19 pandemic. And, we can kind of start back before March if you want, because your perspective on things is slightly different than someone who has been typically doing a ton of performing, and then suddenly in March it all went away. You had been coming at this from a slightly different perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. So there were two things that make my entrance into the pandemic a little bit different from someone else who had been performing a lot, and that is that I had a pretty significant embouchure injury in 2016 that I'm still coming out of, and so my playing really hadn't ramped up that much prior to the pandemic, and also that I've gotten much busier as a composer. So was writing music, and writing music is a very solitary adventure. You're by yourself, you're not around other people, you're just making ideas and working with ideas by yourself at a piano. And so when the pandemic came along, it wasn't the same kind of effect as it was for a heavy performer, because I was kind of already by myself doing my musical thing. in my own space.
So you wouldn't say that your day-to-day was necessarily that affected, right?
Not as a musician. Now, as a teacher, as a college teacher, the entire world was upended.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I assume, like pretty much everyone else in the world, you went completely online, right, for your lessons
Right.
and everything like that. Did that
Hmm.
go pretty well as far as how your students and you adapted?
I think that we adapted quite quickly. It wasn't ideal for anyone, of course. And we would always say in the spring how much we appreciated being in person.
Sure.
We would think about the things that we really enjoyed about being in person, and we can't wait to get back to being in person. But I think that all of my students adapted quite well. One thing that I noticed was I was able to shift from focusing on things like tone production
Mm-hmm.
to other things that you could hear a little bit better over the really bad sound. Like, I didn't have an external microphone and my students didn't have an external
Right.
microphone at that point. And so it would fade in and out, and you couldn't really tell how the students' tone was really progressing. So we worked on a lot of other things, and we did some really basic stuff. I even had a student who didn't have a horn.
Oh my goodness.
She left her horn at PLU and she had gone home to Minnesota.
Okay.
And so we had hour-long lessons where you would do breathing. I remember one lesson where we did a breathing gym video for
Oh,
part of
that's
her
cool.
lesson. And then we would do lots of singing and counting
Mm-hmm.
because she tends to need to work on her ear training and doesn't use her ear as much when she plays. So actually not having a horn in front of her was a really good exercise
Mm-hmm.
for learning music. And we learned a piece of music, I think it was the Gliere Nocturno, simply singing and counting for about a month.
Oh wow.
And then she actually bought a horn, which was great because she'd been using a school horn. So now she has her own horn, which is, I'm really looking forward to working with her on that. And when she started actually playing the music, she could play it because
Oh
she'd
wow.
already learned it. She'd learned the notes and the rhythms, and now she was much more fluent at playing it than she would have been if she just kind of bumbled along and started from actually playing and learning the piece. So that was really interesting.
No, that's really cool.
Too.
And we are always trying to get our students to audiate and sing, and
Right.
so that's a perfect life lesson there of putting that into practice. And you mentioned singing, so singing has always kind of been a big part of your musical identity, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has been. I would say that my voice is incredibly out of shape these days. The last time I truly sang was a recital that I gave a couple of years ago now, which I really enjoyed because I got to work with a voice teacher who's one of my colleagues at
Oh,
PLU.
nice.
And she was terrific. I really like her teaching. And she was able to tap into ways that I was able to connect with my voice in ways I hadn't really before, which seemed kind of incredible because I'm already, in my mid-30s. You'd think I would know how to use my voice. But that was really fun. But I haven't used my voice really since then as a singer.
Hmm.
But because I do have that singing background, horn playing is a lot about singing. And I have all of my students sing, regardless of if they think they sound good. And I always try to reassure them, I don't care if you sound terrible when you sing. It's all about pitch matching.
Right.
You
Yeah.
have to be able to identify how a pitch is going to sound and match that pitch. And I found a little bit of a challenge with some adolescent students that I have who their voices are changing.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they can't quite find what octave they
Mm.
can access. So we're kind of having to wait a little bit on that one until they really can find their voices and they can figure out the octave displacements.
Mm-hmm.
But just I'll have them do counting and rhythm because counting is is a big thing too.
Yes, it is. Yeah. No, that's cool
And
that you mentioned singing, because I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking about our podcast and the kinds of things we could talk about. And so you and I met, I'm trying to think of the date. It was a
oh
while
my goodness.
ago, like 2003 or 2004, maybe.
Well, I would have started at the UW at 2004.
Okay. So University of Wisconsin-Madison, you were starting your master's degree. And I think I was in maybe my first year
Of your doctorate?
doctorate or something like that. No, I might have been finishing. I can't remember. It's all a long
I don't
time ago.
remember.
Anyway, yeah, I know. But
You were
so
there though. I remember that.
yes, yeah. And there's we can talk about UW-Madison forever, but it was a very special place and a very special time. And there was just a lot of great stuff happening. I'm sure there still is, but I've kind of not been as plugged into what's going on there recently as I was back then, obviously. But one thing I remember about you is you were such an awesome horn player, but you were always singing. Like,
Oh, yes.
you always had something you were working on, you were singing it, or it was a melody you were just singing. And so I think it's no surprise that your compositions are so lyrical and you have such an ear for melody. But that's one of my first memories of Gina Gillie is she was always singing something.
That's funny. Yeah, it definitely was. And speaking of composition, melody is a big part of whatever I write. And I'm intrigued by games that you can play with pitches. And I haven't yet. I'm kind of interested in the idea of writing something that's either minimalism or a process piece that doesn't have to do so much with melody. But I have a feeling that there's going to be something melodic in there that even if I'm trying not to be melodic, it's probably going to work its way in.
Well, yeah, I'm sure I think I've played most of the things you've written for horn, if not all of them. I'm actually playing, I've got with air quotes around it, a recital coming up. It's going to be kind of a quasi pre-recorded, maybe live stream. It kind of depends. We lost some rehearsal time with the inclement weather we had, the hurricane that came through the state. So, but anyway, your Reverie is going to be one of the pieces on the program. So I don't think I've not played some of the horn choir stuff you've written, but I've done pretty much all of the solo horn stuff and the horn and voice thing. So I'm certainly no expert on your compositions, but I'm just a big fan. So,
well, it always helps for the composers out there who are listening. It is incredible to have colleagues who are supportive of your writing. And James, you've actually done a lot for me as a composer because you've commissioned some things to write. You've recorded some of my stuff. And that's how composers get ahead, really. That's how they kind of keep moving, is they have people play their stuff. They have people ask them to write stuff. And so as composers, we're really grateful for all of the musicians who are really propelling us forward.
Well, it's always been a pleasure. And it's kind of, I guess it was something I got into in graduate school because, Wisconsin was and continues to be kind of a special place for new music. There's always a lot of the faculty, not just the composition faculty in that school of music, are composers themselves. So there's just a lot of that. It's kind of in the air. And so I really kind of got the bug for new music there. And it's really been something that's been a big part of my career and yours as well. But no, for me, as someone who is at this stage of my life, I know I'm probably never going to be a composer. I mean, I have done composition projects and I recognize that I'll never be Beethoven or something like that. And so I can do little things, but for me, getting the creative bug out is working with someone who's truly creative, working with a composer, or, getting to have some kind of input on my end, or doing arrangements and transcription. That's about as close as I'll probably ever get to being a real composer, but that's good enough for me.
Yeah. And there's a place for all of that. There's a true art to arranging and transcribing.
Yeah, I think so for sure. So you've got an article, and so this episode will probably be released in mid-October. So by this point, the October issue of the Horn Call will be out. And so everyone should be reading Gina's article on embouchure injury and a plan for recovery. Do you want to kind of give a little bit of an overview of that article and maybe hit some of the highlights?
Sure. Essentially, the article is a personal anecdote, my own injury story, and little pieces of advice on how to go about recovering from my experience. So, disclaimer that I don't know everything there is to know about recovery, but what I am hoping to achieve with this article is that it'll start to coalesce players into a larger conversation about injury and recovery, so that there's a wider network of people who are talking about it, and there's a wider network of resources so people know where to go if they find themselves in an injury situation. I've already talked with a few people who watched my video for the IHS
The
symposium,
virtual workshop. Yeah.
the virtual workshop. And what I've gotten from those conversations is that people feel pretty secluded. They feel like not a lot of people talk about it. They don't know where to find the resources. There might be a lot out there about focal dystonia, which is a different topic, but injury, like overuse injuries, is something that it's a little trickier to find information on. And there's probably good information out there, but it hasn't found its way into the mainstream yet.
Yeah, it really, you would think by this point there would be the equivalent of, sports medicine. You'd think there would be the equivalent of, a way to diagnose a particular injury, a prescription for, therapies to both physical and mental, because you talk about the mental side of dealing with an injury. And I think that's perhaps even more traumatic to some players than the physical side is. You mentioned in your article, we identify so much with this hunk of metal that we stick on our face that, when we have to take time off of it, that it can kind of mess with your mental side of things. Do you want to maybe speak to that just a little bit?
Sure. The mental side is huge. Rehabilitating the physical aspect is one thing, but the mind is so involved in the process that it can complicate what you understand is going on with your recovery process, and it can hinder it sometimes. And then when you are actually physically recovered, you have to make sure that your mind catches up with that. Because your mind doesn't necessarily understand that you're through the woods in terms of the physical aspect of it. And it's still afraid of a lot of things. And producing sound in certain ways, it'll just kind of get freaked out. And so I think that the thing that I'm really dealing with now, there are some physical difficulties right now, and especially getting back after a period of rest, because summer plus the pandemic, I didn't play hardly at all. So I'm getting back before the classes start up again. And honestly, it's not physically painful, but it's mentally painful to work it back up, because it's really discouraging. It doesn't really feel good. My endurance is pretty terrible, but I practice consistently and little by little more each day, and it's starting to feel better, which is nice. Starting to get back to a place of, okay, I do enjoy this. I do enjoy playing horn. But that's another mental aspect too, is if everything is really a struggle when you're playing, then you start to wonder, where's my love of this? Where's my love of playing? And it just gets to be a big quagmire. Lots and lots of aspects that you're trying to answer questions. You're trying to find your center. You're trying to find your love of things.
Right.
And all the while, there's a self-worth component that usually comes in if we associate ourselves with being a horn player or being a good horn player.
Mm-hmm.
And if that has trouble, if we start to experience trouble in that, then our sense of self and self-worth can really get thrown into crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of my big pieces of advice to people going through an injury is finding your self-worth or reaffirming your self-worth outside of playing.
Mm-hmm.
You could still be a player and you'll probably get back to being a pretty good player. But as a human being, you are more than you're playing.
Right.
And it takes sometimes a little bit to figure out what am I and what am I that is more than a player.
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. And you use the analogy in your article of like being in a cave and you're not quite sure how you got in there, and it finding your way out can be tricky. But I think reaffirming one's identity is certainly a big part of finding that path into the light from being in that cave, for sure.
That analogy was really helpful for me, and in fact, it was most helpful for me in the sense that it removed some of the anxiety of a timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was self-imposing a timeline of when I needed to be healthy again,
right,
and when I needed to be playing at the level I'd been playing before. It was self-imposed, but I also felt external stressors like colleagues and employers who would be asking, when are you going to get back to playing?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm sure it's well-meaning for the most part, but they don't realize like that's kind of, that can be traumatic in and of itself, that pressure, external and internal of, no, I have to get back in shape. I have to get back where I was, which is probably not that helpful.
And so anyone out there who is talking to someone who is or has gone through an injury, my piece of advice would be the question of how are you doing and where do you think you are in the process is not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It might seem like it is, and it seems caring, it seems like it shows concern, but it's actually fairly stress-inducing.
Yeah.
So if you're hoping to be supportive to someone who's recovering from an injury, affirm wherever they are in the process, affirm that they are there. And I suppose you could tell them you're there to be supportive and bounce ideas off of, or I think therapists can be helpful. I didn't actually go to see a therapist, but if you're struggling with ideas about self-worth or confusion or these different things, and therapists are really good for being non-judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
And even someone who's not a musician, they can help you work through a lot of cognitive issues, because there's a lot of brain functions and thoughts and ideas that are going on in our head with recovery that don't have to do with music. They really have to do with psychology.
Right.
So even a non-musician therapist, I think, would probably be helpful.
Well, yeah, and perhaps even more so than someone who's intimately acquainted with, the ins and outs of brass playing, because they might tend to focus on those details that, as you said, might not be that helpful to ask about. Like, how
does your lip feel? I have no idea.
Right. Yeah. That can be traumatic. So no, well, yeah, that's all great stuff. You mentioned not being judgmental about where you are and accepting who you are and where you are at that point in your playing. One really impactful demonstration of that I heard was at the Kendall Betts Horn Camp. I'm trying to think what year it was that I went. I think it was 2004 for the kids in the room. 2004.
I actually went in 2003, so I just missed you there.
Well, so was Herman Bauman there?
He was there, yeah.
Yeah, and so this was post him having a stroke, and he still played, and it was very inspirational. It was this basically this person who had been at the pinnacle of a horn performance career, and he was still playing the horn. And if someone that has suffered that kind of an injury and something that must have been psychological too, like just the trauma of not being able to play your horn or do anything really the same way that you had before. And he had the courage to just get up there and play something. And that was, at the time, I was like, wow, this is really special to see someone just get up there and do it and not worry about what they had sounded like before and what the judgment was going to be. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I actually was almost more impressed that he had relearned 2 or 3 different languages.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he actually amazing. Lost, I believe he lost the ability to speak.
Wow.
With his stroke, and so he had to relearn German, English, and what other else languages he spoke.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it truly is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. You something you mentioned in your article, and this would be fun to get into. You mentioned the importance of having outside activities. Things that are fun, but help you stay motivated in terms of being a whole person. And you've got some pretty interesting things in your wheelhouse, right? That you do outside of being a musician.
Yeah, I like to find creative outlets. I like to pick probably the hardest thing that you can, if it's an art form, I like to find the hardest form of that art form. So one thing that I do just for fun, and I'm not super great at it, but it's, I think it's artistic and fun, is aerial silks, which is a couple of things. It's really good for strength training. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking for something to build your upper body strength, aerial silks is terrific. Any kind of aerials is good for that. But I also find it to be fairly expressive in terms of movement and shapes and expression through dance.
Okay. So for someone who is kind of ignorant of it like me, what would be sort of your elevator pitch description of what is aerial silks?
Aerial silks?
Yeah.
Well, I usually tell people, Cirque du Soleil, when the people are hanging on the fabric that comes down from the ceiling, those are aerial silks.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
And then everyone goes, oh yeah, I know Cirque du Soleil.
How did you get started in that?
Great question. Well, you probably remember Danielle Kane, that was an undergrad when we were at the UW-Madison. And when she had moved to Cincinnati, I think, after she graduated, and got interested in pole dancing.
Okay.
Which is also another very interesting form of athleticism and movement, dance expression. Mm-hmm. And I would see videos of hers and I would think, boy, that is really interesting. I was kind of fascinated by the flexibility that you needed and the elegance that you could achieve. And so I decided, I'd seen her videos for a couple of years, and then I decided in 2012, one summer, I was like, well, it's summertime and I'm going to do something crazy. I'm going to go take pole dance lessons. So I did, and I really enjoyed it. And I did pole for about 2 years before I broke my left wrist.
Okay.
Which is a really bad thing to break if you want to do anything that requires you to hang on to something.
I think I remember you telling me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also bad for horn playing, by the way. But I was able to play my natural horn with a broken wrist. So after I came back from my broken wrist, I thought, well, my studio was offering aerials, and there was an instructor who was doing aerial hoop. So I started doing aerial hoop, which is very painful. And if you're going to do hoop, you're going to get a ton of bruises, just letting you know.
So this is kind of like...
It's like a big circle of metal.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
And you use that as sort of the focus, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, that's the apparatus that you hang on and contort yourself around.
Yeah, I would imagine bruises would be part and parcel of that.
And I did enjoy hoop, but what I really wanted to do was the silks.
Okay.
Because I'd always thought that they looked really neat. And so then they started teaching silks lessons. And so I I started taking the silks lessons. I think it was in 2015. So I just kind of started my aerial silks journey, and I've done a couple of performances. I would like to be able to do more with it, but there's a balance issue in anybody's life. You've got your professional life, you've got your family life, you've got all of these other projects that are calling your name, you know, practicing your horn, writing music, and then, oh yeah, by the way, maybe you need to go out and practice your silks.
Right.
So I haven't been able to progress to a level that's highly, you know, any kind of high achievement on the silks, but it still provides some impetus for staying flexible, which is really important as you age, to try and stay flexible, strength, and some sort of artistic expression.
It seems to me that it's one of those things that's, when it's done well, it appears effortless.
Right.
But if you didn't know what you were doing and you tried to do it, it would just like wreck you.
You know, the older I get, the less flexible I get, and I really will never be able to achieve some of those amazing moves on the silks. But one thing that sometimes keeps me going is, if you can do simple things incredibly elegantly, it's still impressive. And it's still beautiful. And it's like that with music too. You could play the simplest piece of music, but if you play it with elegance and with skill and with immaculate control and expression, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, like one note sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
That's awesome. I know I've seen some video of you doing something like that. Maybe was it like in your backyard or something like that?
Yeah, and Christina Masher-Turner did a newsletter where she highlighted non-horn playing skills, and I included a segment in there, and I think I linked a video that was one of my performances.
I'll post that link in the highlights from the show, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, since it was already published in the e-newsletter. Well, that's awesome.
Just like in any performance, I always wish there's things that had gone better, but yeah.
Well, but I'm sure, just like in any musical performance, like to the casual observer, they're not going to notice.
Wow, okay.
Yeah,
you're hanging upside down.
Speaking of the IHS, you mentioned Christina Masher-Turner, who's the vice president of the IHS. Let's talk a little bit about, you just took over a new role with the International Horn Society, the editor of the online music sales. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe what your experience stepping into that role has been like?
Sure. Darren Robbins was, for I think 10 years, the editor for the online music sales for the IHS. And I joined the team, the editorial team, maybe like a year and a half ago.
I think you joined about the same time I did. It's
okay.
Yeah, around the same time. And for anyone that doesn't know, and if we're on the team, we just call it the OMS, the online music sales.
Yeah.
So this is I think it's continuing to grow based on the number of emails I'm seeing and the number of submissions. So the history of this is, it goes back to, there used to be an IHS press back when things were a little more, conventional, less digital distribution of sheet music. But now it's an exclusively online distribution, venue or hub for composers who want to write for the horn. And the really cool thing for any composers out there that might want to submit their works to Gina for the OMS is that the royalties are significantly better than most other publishing houses can do. It's 25%, and most publishing houses give you 10% if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So 25% is pretty darn good.
Yeah. And if you're a composer, the whole world of publishing is a really interesting topic in a way. When I first got into publishing, or when I first got into composing, I had no idea about the world of publishing. And the way I got my foot in the door was I had Jeff Snedeker introduce me to someone. And so I got in by way of networking.
Right.
Finding someone, and knew nothing about contracts and what they meant. And if you sign, we're getting a little bit away from OMS.
No,
but,
that's fine. No, that's what a podcast is for. Little digressions, and we'll eventually get back to where we were.
Sure. So if you get with a publisher and they want you to sign a full publishing contract, you are signing away the rights to your composition, so you do not own your music anymore. The publisher owns it, and they can do with it as they see fit. They can change it. They usually don't, but they could mix it up. They could send it off to be in a music video or something. And you get 10% of the sales price.
Those are your royalties. Yeah.
Those are your royalties. Yeah. So I really didn't know anything about that. And what I really wanted most was to have someone help me get my music out there. Because one thing that I'm not great at and that I really don't have a lot of interest in is marketing. But a lot of composers nowadays will do self-marketing and will even do self-publishing. Self-publishing is becoming quite preferable for a lot of composers because you get to keep all of the money that you sell. Even people like Eric Whitaker, who is a very well-known choral composer, self-publishes. A colleague I have who's a choral composer, Brian Galante, he self-publishes.
Jim Stevenson.
Yeah, a lot of these people self-publish, and I do have a select number of pieces on my website that I self-publish just because I haven't felt like giving them to a publisher. But I do give some of my pieces that I think will probably be more popular. I give them to Brass Arts. And what I like about Dave is that he does a lot of marketing that I would never do.
This is Dave Weiner, the owner of Brass Arts Unlimited,
Right. And so he goes to conferences and he takes my music and he has a well-maintained website and he makes announcements about pieces as they come out. And so he has sold many more copies of my music than I would have if I just put it on my own personal website. So I've gotten a fraction of the money from selling that music, but what's more important to me is that people are actually playing it.
Right. Yeah.
So if I were trying to survive solely as a composer, and if I was trying to survive on royalties, then that would maybe be more problematic, and I might want to think about getting into a real hardcore self-marketing, self-publishing thing. But since I can afford to not be raking it in with the royalties, it is nice to have someone else be in charge of getting the music out there. So that's one thing that if you're wondering, should I self-publish or should I go with a publisher? With Brass Arts, I have a printing and distribution contract instead of a publishing contract.
Ooh, talk about that. What's the difference?
I had no idea what the difference was at first, but when I first submitted my stuff to Dave, he's like, do you want a printing P&D or do you want a publishing? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. What's the difference? And so it took like 5 emails for me to understand what this was. But printing and distribution is really like what the OMS does.
Okay.
Where you submit your materials to this particular publisher and they simply are in charge of printing it and distributing it, basically.
Getting it out there. Yeah.
Getting it out there. So when people purchase it, they get it out there and they're the intermediary for the buying and selling. And I pretty meticulously edit my scores. So there's not a lot of editorial work that needs to be done with them. If I did not, though, this would be a little bit complicated because there's a fee that's charged. If you just go with the P&D, then the publisher will say, well, I'm going to charge this much an hour for editing services.
Or if they have to re-engrave it or,
Whereas if you sign the publishing contract, they are going to take care of everything.
I see.
because it's theirs now. They own it.
Right. So they're gonna give it the full treatment. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, that is interesting. And yeah, I did I knew that the arrangement with the OMS was different than what like a traditional publisher would do. But no,
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense.
Oh, but the big difference is with the printing and distributing, I own the copyright.
I see. Okay.
So I have full say over, what happens with that music.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually why I went printing and distributing, is because I would not be giving away the copyright to my music.
It would be like owning the rights to the master recording if you made a CD or an album of some kind.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're like me, there was nothing in your undergrad or advanced degrees that prepared you in any way for the marketing, legal / commercial side of the music business.
No, it's really been learn as you go.
Yes,
for me.
100%. Although I think that is changing. Like I think a lot of schools are starting to recognize in their curriculum that, hey, we might want to get something in there about, marketing or how to build an effective website or how to use social media correctly to promote yourself. Because it's, it was put into, sharp relief with this COVID-19 pandemic that now everybody is producing video content and trying to carve out some space in the digital world. But I don't think this is going away in terms of, now that the standard has been set with everybody is doing more of this. I think when the pandemic finally dies down, I think there's still going to be a place for all of this stuff.
Right. And it's actually something that I teach composition now at PLU too.
Oh, that's awesome.
Pacific Lutheran University, which is where I teach. I'm in my second year of teaching composition, and this is something that we fit into our series of seminars.
Okay.
For our composition students is about publishing and commissioning too, because commissioning is a big thing for composers.
That's how you get paid.
That's how you get paid. And my commission structure has drastically changed over the years. If you don't mind me sharing,
no, please do.
A little bit about.
No.
So the first time I was paid for writing a piece of music was in 2014. Actually, in 2012, I should have been paid to write a piece of music, but I didn't know that I could ask to be paid, so I wrote it for free.
What piece was that?
This was The Great Migration.
Oh, the two horns and piano. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that I was supposed to set a fee, and so I just wrote it. And then the next time, Elliot Higgins, who ran the Hummingbird camp, he asked me to write, because he'd heard my To the Seasons, which was my first big piece that I wrote for my dissertation. He asked me to write a brass trio. So that was the first brass trio that I wrote. And he paid me $100 per movement. And there were 3 movements.
Okay.
So I got $300 for 10 minutes of music. All you listening out there, that is peanuts.
Yeah, that's pretty. I was gonna say that's pretty low, but
it's pretty low. But I didn't know. I was like, oh, someone's paying me to write music. This is so exciting.
It's like when you get your first gig as a horn player. If you get anything, you're thrilled.
Right. And so then the next person, John Hargreaves, commissioned me to write a horn quartet. And he paid me a pretty decent fee. He paid me $2,000 to write, I think it's about 17-minute horn quartet. And so I've had some pretty good commissions along the way. But about a year ago, I decided, you know what, I really need to work on my commission fee structure. And so I researched what some people were asking for, and you have to think about ensemble size, how many parts are you writing for, duration of the piece, so how many minutes of music, and these are all things that you have to decide with your commissioner. And then you create a fee structure based on those things. So for example, you might say, for an unaccompanied solo piece, I charge $100 per minute. That's just an example.
Right.
And then, of course, the larger the ensemble gets, the more per minute
Right.
that you charge. And if you think about it, I like to compare it to a musician playing in an orchestra. When I played in the Tacoma Symphony, we would make about $120 per rehearsal, per service. Yeah. And that was there were 2.5 hour services.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just say you make $50 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet that a lot of private lessons teachers charge between $50 and $60.
That seems to be the going rate now.
Yeah. And that's an hour of honest work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when you're composing, you spend hours of honest work. And so just to give people an idea of when they're commissioning, think about what is the time of the composer worth?
Mm-hmm.
And if you like this person's music, then that is an affirmation that you are telling them, I know your time is worth this much money.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That was a big sort of revelation or change in my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
When it wasn't just, I'm doing this because I like to or because someone asked me, that it is honest work and it's very creative work, and it's also difficult. There's a lot of problem solving that goes into it. So I never really thought of it as a performer from that perspective. I might think like, whoa, $2,000 for a new piece of music. That's a lot of money. But if you break it all down, you realize, well, that's pretty reasonable, actually.
Right. On a per hour, amount of work put in. Now, is there, for a new composer who's looking to do what you did and take a little more professionalized approach to their fee structure, where can they go for help? And in terms of, is there anything online or any books about that sort of thing?
I went to composers who I had gotten to know.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know them well, but I figured this person has a similar investment in composing. For example, there's a man who taught at Washington State University, a bassoon player, Rainier. And he actually recently retired from teaching because he wanted to get into composition full time. Okay. But he was a bassoon player, bassoon teacher. That was most of his identity for a long time. But then he really got interested in composing. Okay. And I thought, well, I find myself in a similar place. And so I'll ask him what his fee structure is, because it seems like maybe I could do something that's comparable. Right. So I looked for people who I thought that their background in composing or what they were doing with composing was kind of similar to what I was doing. And I just asked them what their fee structures were, and then crafted mine around that. Something I notice about your compositional style is that you work really hard, and the pieces are always really well crafted, and you take a lot of care in like doing research. Like you mentioned that brass trio that you were commissioned by Elliot Higgins to write. One of the movements is a tango, if I remember correctly. Right. And I think I remember you telling me, like, I'd never written a tango before, so I did research on how tangos were composed. So I think that's really cool. And then your sonata for horn and piano that Steve Cohen commissioned, like each movement is basically in a different style, right? Yeah. And it's your ability to emulate those styles while still keeping your own voice. I'm not a music theorist or a musicologist or anything like that, but to my ear and to my my sense of things, you did it really well. Do you want to talk about how that became a part of what you do when you compose? Not that that's not everything you do as a composer, but certainly in those pieces, it struck me that, oh, hey, she's writing in this French style, but it's still Gina's voice, but I can tell it's French, or I can tell this is, whatever. So. Yeah, I think a really important tool for composers is score study.
Okay.
And if I want to write in a certain style, I go find a score by a composer that I admire
Mm-hmm.
and a piece that's fairly simple. I try and select something of theirs that isn't crazy, but something I can digest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked at Fauré
Mm-hmm.
scores, and sometimes I'll look at Debussy if I want to
Okay.
try and write something kind of French impressionist.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Anytime I'm wanting to write in a certain style, I go find a score
Mm.
that is from that particular style, and I try and dissect what's happening here. How are the parts fitting together? What's the structure of the tonal language? What's
Mm-hmm.
the structure of the rhythmic language? And then I start fitting my own ideas together. But the
Mm.
funny thing is, I cannot get away from my own voice.
That
So
goes back to that earlier story we were talking
yeah.
about. Yeah.
So if I try and write something in a particular style, it's gonna sound like me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually fascinating about composition.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that you like to do this too, where you'll turn on the radio and you'll listen to a few seconds or a minute of what's happening on the classical station, and you'll say, "Okay, name that
Oh
composer."
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's the
is
music
it,
history teacher in me.
yeah,
Yeah.
but isn't it incredible though that's a thing, that
Yeah. Yeah.
composers just sound like themselves?
Yeah. It's as
And
distinct as the sound of your speaking voice or the sound of your voice on an instrument. It's pretty amazing.
yeah, even though we're using all the same notes, we're using a lot of the same instruments,
Mm-hmm.
you can just tell what the way
Yeah.
that someone speaks and the way they write music, who it is.
Yeah. And I would imagine that it's similar to, someone who deals with the written word. You begin by
Yeah.
basically just reading a lot and finding the
Mhm.
authors that you respect or that you enjoy, or you find something about them that pulls you in as a reader, and then you kind of just imitate them for a while, and then at some
Yeah.
point you have enough experience, you have enough theory and knowledge of it under your belt that your own voice gets in there without you necessarily having to worry too much about it.
Right. And sometimes I try and get away from my own voice, but it never works. It always comes back.
Well, no, I think that is the sign of a composer, someone who is comfortable with their style and is not, necessarily trying to imitate something else. You're writing the way you write, and even when you imitate something else, your voice comes through. So I think there's a life lesson in there.
Somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, stay true to yourself no matter
Yeah,
what.
one of the big fears I have about it as a composer is that it will sound too simplistic or too repetitive or too predictable.
Hmm.
Those are the kinds of things that as a composer I worry about when I'm writing. And
Mm-hmm.
so I usually try and play little rhythm games or, twists of harmony games
Mm-hmm.
such that those things don't happen. But what's funny about that is when you play those games, you actually end up doing some things that make you sound like you, like
Mm-hmm.
particular ways that you move in your harmony. What's funny is I'll listen to something of mine and I'll go, oh, I did that same thing in this other piece.
Oh.
And I didn't remember it or didn't realize it. But now I realize, or I'll sing a melody, just make up a melody and sing it. And then I'll realize, oh, I was trying to be really unique in the direction I went with that melody.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that I did something that is a habit of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so composers are usually on the lookout for their habits,
That's
whether they
cool.
want to maintain those habits or whether they want to kind of break away from those habits.
Oh, that's really cool. Um, I want to talk a little bit about a project you were involved in that kind of ties a lot of these things together, the recovering from an injury, and then your interest I mean, not just an interest, your profession as a composer, the Phoenix Project. Do you want to talk a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a terrific project that Ashley Goldbrunson um, did for her doctorate, I believe.
Okay.
And she has experienced focal dystonia.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted to put together a project where she commissioned different composers to write pieces for players who struggle with focal dystonia and or injury issues.
Mm-hmm.
And she had heard that I'd had an injury. Oh, no, she had been at a Northwest Horn Symposium,
Okay.
actually. And I mentioned I wasn't really playing because I was injured. And so we had a conversation together, and she shared some of her knowledge that she learned from Jan Kagarais.
Okay.
He's
Yeah.
a real big embouchure rehabilitator. So since Ashley knew that I was dealing with this injury situation, and she also knew that I was a composer,
Mm-hmm.
that was why she reached out to me to be a part of this particular project, to write music for players with focal dystonia that's very approachable. And I think it was absolutely terrific project, because it can be challenging to find music that's accessible if you have playing limitations. And so the piece that I wrote had several parameters that I followed so that it would be accessible to people who were either injured or coming back from injury, who had focal dystonia, or maybe even people with braces.
Right. Yeah.
Because when you get those braces on, your range can diminish.
And this is your Reverie for horn and piano.
Yeah, this is Reverie for horn and piano. And so the range is somewhat limited. It doesn't go above an F. And in fact, when it does go up into that range a couple times, it is optional. So people can make the choice. There are a lot of slurs. So when you're recovering from both an injury and focal dystonia, the tongue can be disruptive sometimes. So slurring things is a much easier way to produce sound. Exactness of attacks can be tricky. So there's some flexibility in that. So all of these different parameters, but at the same time making it musical and making it interesting and fun to play. And so I took the piece through, I called it Reverie because I wanted to signify this journey through kind of a daydream, different components of what a daydream might consist of. So it's kind of dreamy at the beginning, and it gets into different little snapshots of, gets a little bit fiery at one point. So a person can explore a diverse way of expressions within the musical style. You don't have to stay in one thing. And I really do hope that it's a piece for people to pick up if they have some of those playing limitations. And so I'm really hoping it can fit that little niche, the intention that it was written for, and just let people know that it's out there in case I need repertoire to play, but I've got these things that are issues right now.
No, it's a great piece. And I mean, I don't want to say I've stolen it, but I'm not using it for necessarily that purpose. I just thought it was a cool piece. I was, looking for something to, go on the second half of a recital program and looking for something lyrical to kind of fill out the style on the program. And I knew that you had written this piece because I had heard about it when it was performed, premiered. I think Ashley played the premiere at a Northwest Horn workshop. So I had listened to that. Yeah, I listened to that recording. I was like, hey, this is a cool piece. I just want to play it. So I would certainly support anyone that's going through that process to check out Gina's Reverie, but also anybody that just wants a really beautiful piece to play. It's about 8 minutes or so. It's a substantial piece. It's
about 10 minutes,
okay.
Although Ashley's recording is 12. So
oh wow.
yeah. So it can be played a little bit faster than
there's
that.
some flexibility though, which is nice to have. And I always am looking for pieces that I could recommend to students. And that piece certainly fits that bill of this would be a substantial piece on a recital for like an undergrad, but depending on the player and their abilities, it would be something that a younger player or a player without, a huge range could play, but there's still plenty to be learned from it. So,
Yeah.
no, I think it's certainly a piece to check out.
Just beware, the piano part is way harder than the horn part. So your
Like
pianist
Hindemith.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, your pianist is going to love me in some places.
No, the recording, go check it out. I think if you just Google Gina Gillie or YouTube search Gina Gillie Reverie for horn and piano, it'll pop right up. Ashley's recording of it is fantastic. So that's a really good introduction to the piece. I could keep talking to you for a really long time, Gina. You know, we're old friends, and this has been fantastic. We've been corresponding quite a bit via email, but it's nice to talk to you Zoom to Zoom or screen to screen. Do you want to talk about any upcoming projects you have? Maybe it's kind of a good way to close out our discussion today.
Yeah. This summer, I spent a lot of time composing, and I wrote a piece for trombone, horn, and piano, which was commissioned by Jason Johnston from the University of Idaho.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's kind of a fun piece. It was made to be an opener, so it's pretty peppy, exciting little piece. I'm also writing a trombone, I know, octet for Jeremy Marks.
Okay, yeah.
He's doing a commissioning project for his studio.
Oh, cool.
And I also need to write a horn ensemble piece. I started and nearly completed a horn octet in January.
Okay.
But I'm not like wild about it. And so I think I might just want to start over. But I've got a few ideas I'm kicking around, and I just recently watched a composer's seminar thing that Eric Whitaker did with the King Singers, because the King Singers are doing a composition contest and they're having workshops. Oh. And when Eric Whitaker was talking, he mentioned an orchestral piece he had written called Deep Field. Okay. Which is an orchestral piece that's paired with images from the Hubble telescope, but also other NASA images of space. And it is incredibly moving. Okay. And for whatever reason, wherever I am right now in my life, whenever it gets to the climax, I get chills and I get tears.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Whatever it is, it's incredibly moving to me, just the vastness of space and the sonorities coming out of the orchestra.
I'll have to check that piece out. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of a sound that's going on in my head right now. I'm kind of curious to see if I could make something happen with a horn ensemble kind of like that, but not even close because I don't have strings.
No, that sounds awesome. And thank you so much for talking with me today, Gina, and good luck with all of your awesome projects coming up.
Thank you. Thanks, James.